It lasted 47 minutes. I know because I counted the time remaining on the film when it started, and I watched the number go down, and I did not move my hand. Neither did she. The film ended. The lights came up. She let go. In the way you let go of something, when you have decided the moment is over and you are going to behave as though it did not happen. And she said, "That ending was terrible." And I said, "Completely inexcusable." And we walked out of the cinema and into the cold and talked about the film the entire way home, and neither of us mentioned the 47 minutes. And I lay awake until 2 in the morning understanding that something had changed and I was not going to be able to change it back. That was a Saturday in March. It is now a different kind of Saturday entirely. I had known Priya Mehta for 9 years. We had met in the first week of university. The way you meet people in the first week of university, thrown together by proximity and the mutual need to not be alone in a new place. And it simply never stopped. Through the rest of university, through the years after, through the moves and the jobs and the relationships that hadn't worked out, through the accumulated geography of two people who had ended up in the same city by coincidence, and then, I think, had stayed by something less accidental than that. She was the person I called first. That is not a small fact. When something went right or went wrong, when I needed to think something through, or simply needed to say it out loud, it was Priya's name that came up first in my head and then in my phone. I had always understood this as evidence of a good friendship. I had not, for a long time, understood it as evidence of anything else. Then, she held my hand in the dark for 47 minutes, and I spent the walk home talking about cinematography, while something rearranged itself in my chest without my permission. My name is Tom Okafor. I am 31 years old. I work in structural engineering, which means I spend my days thinking about how things hold together and what happens when they don't, which is either completely irrelevant to what happened or the most relevant thing about me, depending on who you ask. I live in a flat with a very good sofa and not enough natural light, and I am, by my own assessment, someone who notices details and is slow to draw conclusions from them, which has served me reasonably well in my profession and less well in my personal life. Priya was 30. She worked as a documentary researcher, which meant she was professionally trained to find the thing underneath the thing, the real story beneath the stated one. She had been doing this in our friendship for 9 years without me fully appreciating the irony. She had dark hair she wore down on the weekends and up when she was working, which I had observed across 9 years without noting it as an observation worth examining. She had a specific laugh for things she found genuinely funny versus things she found socially funny, and I had known the difference for so long that I no longer noticed I knew it. She had a habit with films. She watched them with her knees pulled up when she was on a sofa, or leaning slightly forward in a cinema seat when something had her attention, and she went very still when something moved her. I had been watching this for 9 years. I had called it knowing her well. I had not called it anything else. The film on Saturday had been her choice. A period drama, which she had sold to me as being not as slow as it looked, which was accurate. 40 minutes in, she had reached across in the dark and taken my hand in the straightforward way you reach for something you expect to be there, without announcement, without asking, and I had let her take it without saying anything. Because saying something would have required knowing what to say, and I had not known. And 47 minutes had gone past while we watched the screen, and I cataloged the specific weight of her hand and the fact that she did not let go. When I got home that night, I sat on the sofa and attempted to perform a rational assessment of the evidence, which is the kind of thing a structural engineer does when confronted with information his existing framework does not accommodate. The evidence was 9 years of first phone calls, 47 minutes, her not mentioning it, me not mentioning it, and a feeling in my chest that I had apparently been storing somewhere I had not been checking. The rational assessment did not produce a comfortable conclusion. I did not mention it on Sunday. She texted me about something unrelated, a podcast she thought I should listen to, and I replied normally, and we had a normal exchange, and I read it 3 times afterward looking for something that might tell me what Saturday had been, and found nothing conclusive, which I found inconclusive. The following Tuesday, she came over for dinner, which was a standing arrangement we had had for years. I cooked. She sat at my kitchen counter and talked about a project she was working on, and I listened in the way I had been listening to her for 9 years, and everything was completely normal, except that it was not, because I was now conducting myself across a distance I had not previously been aware of. She noticed, she said, somewhere between the main course and the point at which I had been planning to pretend we were moving on, "You've been somewhere else tonight." I said, "Sorry. Work thing." She looked at me with the expression she used when she had assessed something and arrived at a different conclusion than the one being offered. She said, "Is it a work thing?" I said, "Mostly." She said, "Tom." I said, "Priya." She put her fork down. She said, "Can I say something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "I've been thinking about Saturday. The kitchen did the thing where it went quiet, even though nothing had made noise." I said, "Okay." She said, "I've been thinking about why I did that and what I was expecting, and why neither of us said anything after. And I have come to the conclusion that the not saying anything is worse than the saying something, so I'm going to say something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I didn't reach for your hand because of the film." I said, "Nothing." She said, "The film gave me a reason to do something I had been working up to for longer than I've been comfortable admitting, and I thought if I did it, you would either. I thought your response would tell me something, whether you moved your hand or didn't. And you didn't. And I've spent 4 days trying to decide what that means, and I think the not mentioning it afterward might be its own kind of answer, but I would prefer the actual version. Something in my chest did the thing it had been doing since Saturday, but larger now, more insistent, less possible to file away. I said, "How long?" She said, "How long what?" I said, "How long have you been working up to it?" She looked at her plate for a moment. She said, "About 2 years, probably closer to 3. I noticed something shift, and I made a decision to not notice it. Because this is 9 years, Tom, and I didn't want to be the person who made 9 years of this complicated because of something that might not be returned. I said 3 years. She said, "Approximately." I said, "I have poor observational skills in certain areas." She said, "You notice everything." I said, "About structures, about load and stress and what things are built to hold. Not about." I stopped. I said, "I noticed Saturday. I noticed every minute of it. I've been sitting with it for 4 days not knowing what to say." She said, "What stopped you from saying something?" I said, "The same thing that stopped you for 3 years." She looked at me. She said, "Which was?" I said, "Not knowing if it was returned. Not wanting to be wrong about something that would change 9 years of something that already meant everything." She was very still in the way she went still when something had moved her. She said, "And now?" I said, "And now you've said it first." I said, "I should have said something on Saturday. I should have said something instead of 47 minutes of saying nothing." I said, "Priya." I said her name the way it deserved to be said, not as punctuation but as the thing itself. I said, "I have been calling you first for 9 years. You are the first call. You have always been the first call. And I understood that as friendship because that's what I knew how to call it, and I think I've been wrong about that for at least as long as you've been working up to Saturday. She said, at least? I said, probably longer. I told you. Poor observational skills in certain areas. She laughed. It was the real one, the one I had known from the fake one for years, and hearing it now felt like something clicking into the correct position, the way a structure settles when you get the load distribution right. She put her hand flat on the table between us. She did not reach across. She left it there, palm up, and let me decide. I put mine over it. She said, quietly, "You didn't move your hand." I said, "I wasn't going to move my hand." She said, "I know that now." I said, "I should have said so at the time." She said, "You're saying it now." Neither of us said anything for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds, which is the sound of everything continuing normally while something inside a particular flat changes completely. She stayed later than usual. We moved to the sofa at some point, and she pulled her knees up the way she always did, and we talked past midnight. Not about the last 4 days, but about everything adjacent to them. The years of it, the things we had both noticed and filed incorrectly, the first phone calls, the way certain things had felt different from other things without us naming why. She said, "I thought I was imagining it." I said, "I thought I was misreading it." She said, "We were both quite bad at this." I said, "We were. I am usually better with load-bearing structures." She said, "Is that what this is?" I said, "I think this might be the most load-bearing thing I've got." She went quiet in the way that meant something had landed, and she turned and looked at me across the sofa, and I said, "I'm glad you didn't let go." She said, "I almost did. About 30 minutes in, I thought I had misread it." I said, "What stopped you?" She said, "You didn't move your hand." I said I was not going to move my hand. The Tuesday dinners continued. Nothing about them changed except everything about them, which is the paradox of something becoming what it always should have been. You cannot point to the alteration, because the thing itself is the same. She still sat at my counter. I still cooked. She still talked about her projects, and I still listened in the particular way I had been listening to her for 9 years, except now I did not pretend that the way I listened was simply what good friends did. 8 months later, she moved in, which we had not planned, and which happened so gradually that it was almost accomplished before we announced it. A toothbrush first. Then a shelf. Then the acknowledgement that she was spending more nights here than at her own place, and the question of whether to keep paying for 2 flats that functioned as one, and the answer that felt obvious once it was asked. 2 years later, when people asked us how it started, I said she held my hand at the cinema. She said, "He didn't let go." When they asked why it took so long, she said, "We were both waiting for the other one to say something." I said, "I thought I was misreading it." She said, "I thought I was imagining it." They always asked who finally said something first. She had. I had known she would. She had always been the braver one about saying the true thing. I had always been better at holding on once I understood what I was holding. Nothing had changed, really. She still watched films with her knees up. I still noticed the real laugh from the other one. She still sent me podcasts on Sunday mornings. I still called her first, except now first was from the same room, and the phone stayed in my pocket, and I did not need it. It had probably always been her. 9 years in the same city, the same sofa, the same first phone call. I had just needed 47 minutes in the dark and 4 days of sitting with it to understand what I had been holding on to all along. What would you have done if your best friend held your hand in the dark for 47 minutes and neither of you said a word about it after? And have you ever understood something too late? Something that had been true for years before you were brave enough to call it by its real name? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.